A chance encounter. Thaddeus Langston sat alone in the corner of an opulent restaurant, the ambience of soft music and murmuring patrons a dull backdrop to his restless mind. The empire he had built, Langston Enterprises, sprawled across the skyline, an indomitable testament to his success. Yet tonight, the weight of that success felt heavier than ever. His sharp suit and meticulously groomed appearance couldn't hide the weariness etched into his features. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, staring into the depths of his whiskey as though it held answers. Tonight marked another hollow milestone, another lucrative deal signed, another meaningless celebration. At 48 years old, Thaddeus was a self-made billionaire, yet something fundamental felt missing. Just as he was about to retreat further into his thoughts, a movement across the room caught his attention. A woman entered the restaurant, her poise commanding the space effortlessly. Thaddeus froze as recognition hit him like a tidal wave. It was Eloane Carter, his ex-wife. His heart skipped a beat, an odd mix of curiosity and trepidation bubbling to the surface. She had aged gracefully, her dark hair now streaked with hints of silver, her presence as striking as ever. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught his eye. 3 children trailed behind her. A teenage girl with sharp features, a boy around 10 who exuded mischief, and a younger girl clutching a sketchpad tightly. Thaddeus' world tilted as he stared at the children. Their features were startlingly familiar. Their eyes, their noses, even the way the boy tilted his head reminded him of himself. His chest tightened with a suspicion that was too wild to consider. Could they be? Eloane's gaze swept the room and landed on him. Her expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of surprise and something else he couldn't quite name. She didn't look away. Instead, she held his gaze for a long, tense moment before signaling the maitre d' to lead her to a table not far from his. Thaddeus's mind raced. It had been nearly 2 decades since their paths had crossed. Their marriage had ended abruptly, a casualty of his insatiable ambition and her unwillingness to compete with it. Eloane had left without much explanation, disappearing into a life he hadn't bothered to follow. He had rationalized it at the time, convincing himself that love was a distraction he couldn't afford. But now, seeing her again, he couldn't ignore the pang of regret that lanced through him. Gathering his courage, Thaddeus stood and approached her table. As he drew closer, the children's chatter quieted, and Eloane looked up, her expression guarded. "Eloane," he said, his voice steady but strained. "It's been a long time." She didn't smile, but her eyes flickered with recognition. "Thaddeus," she replied, her tone neutral. "It has." The children looked at him curiously, the youngest girl clutching her sketchpad even tighter. The teenage girl, Zoe, if he heard Eloane call her correctly, eyed him with a sharp, probing gaze that made him feel uncharacteristically vulnerable. Thaddeus cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. "I couldn't help but notice your children. They look familiar." Eloane's expression hardened. She set her utensils down with deliberate care before meeting his gaze head-on. "That's because they're yours, Thaddeus." The words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, his usually unshakable composure cracking. His mind raced, trying to process what she had just said. His children? How could that be possible? Why hadn't she told him? "Mine," he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand." Eloane sighed, her guarded demeanor softening just slightly. "We need to talk," she said, "but not here. Not now." She slid a business card across the table. "Call me tomorrow, if you're serious." The tension between them was palpable, the unspoken history heavy in the air. Thaddeus nodded numbly, taking the card with a trembling hand. His gaze shifted to the children again, Zoe's skeptical glare, the boy's nervous fidgeting, the youngest girl's wide, curious eyes. As he walked back to his table, his legs felt like lead. The realization settled over him like a storm cloud. He had spent decades building an empire, amassing wealth and power beyond his wildest dreams. Yet in doing so, he had overlooked the one thing that might have truly mattered. That night, Thaddeus couldn't sleep. Elon's words echoed relentlessly in his mind. His children. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. If they were truly his, what did that mean for the life he had built? And more importantly, could he undo the damage of 2 decades of absence? He stared at the business card on his nightstand, the inked letters mocking him with their simplicity. This was his chance, a chance to face the past, to confront the choices that had shaped his life. But was he brave enough to take it? As dawn broke over the city, Thaddeus made his decision. He picked up his phone, dialed the number, and waited as the line connected. Elon's voice was calm but cautious as she answered. "Elon," he said, his voice firm despite the nervous tremor in his chest. "I'm ready to talk." Little did he know, this conversation would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about family, and about the true cost of success. A storm of questions. The following evening, Thaddeus sat in his office, his empire gleaming in the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. His world had always been one of control, every deal meticulously planned, every decision calculated. Yet now, his life felt like it was spinning out of control. He couldn't shake the image of the 3 children from his mind. Their faces, their expressions. It was like looking into a mirror of his younger self. The card Elon had given him lay on his desk, its edges worn from his restless fingers. He had called her earlier, and they had agreed to meet the next day at her modest home, far removed from the lavish lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. It felt surreal, stepping into a world he had chosen to leave behind so many years ago. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the ceiling. Memories of Elon came flooding back, her laughter, her fierce independence, and the way she had looked at him when they were young and in love. Back then, they had dreams of a shared future, but somewhere along the way, his dreams had consumed hers. He had always believed he was doing it for both of them, for their future, but when she had left, he realized too late that she had been asking for his presence, not his wealth. Thaddeus sighed, pushing the thoughts aside. Tomorrow wasn't about their past. It was about the children, his children. The thought sent a jolt of fear through him. What kind of father could he possibly be after all this time? Would they even want him in their lives? The next day, he arrived at Elon's home, a modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood. It was a far cry from the penthouses and mansions he was used to, but there was something warm about it. As he stepped out of his sleek black car, he noticed a small bike propped up against the porch railing and a soccer ball resting on the lawn. The ordinary scene tugged at something deep within him. Elon opened the door before he could knock. She looked calm but wary, her arms crossed over a simple sweater. "You're on time," she remarked, stepping aside to let him in. The interior of the house was cozy, filled with personal touches, a bookshelf overflowing with novels, framed photos on the walls, and a faint smell of freshly baked cookies lingering in the air. It was a home, something Thaddeus realized he hadn't experienced in years. "They're in the living room," Elon said, leading him down the hall. "I told them you were coming." "They're apprehensive, to say the least." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. As they entered the living room, the 3 children looked up. Zoe, the eldest, was sitting on the couch with her arms crossed, her sharp gaze fixed on him. Max, the middle child, was fiddling with a Rubik's Cube, avoiding eye contact. Izzy, the youngest, clutched her sketchpad as though it were a lifeline, her wide eyes darting between him and her mother. "Kids," Elon said, her tone firm but gentle. "This is Thaddeus. He's your father." The room went silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Thaddeus forced a small smile, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "Hi," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It's nice to meet you all." Zoe was the first to speak, her tone sharp. "You mean nice to meet you for the first time, right? Because where have you been all these years? Her words cut through him like a knife. He had expected hostility, but hearing it out loud was a different matter entirely. "You're right," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I wasn't there. And I'm sorry for that. I don't have an excuse, but I want to make things right, if you'll let me." Max finally looked up, his expression skeptical. "Why now? Why do you suddenly care?" Thaddeus hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I didn't know. I didn't know about any of you until yesterday. And now that I do, I can't ignore it. I don't want to." Izzy's small voice broke the tension. "Did you know I like to draw?" she asked, holding up her sketchpad. Her question was simple, but the vulnerability in her voice was palpable. "I didn't," Thaddeus admitted, kneeling to her level. "But I'd love to see your drawing someday." Izzy studied him for a moment before nodding shyly, clutching her sketchpad tighter. Zoe rolled her eyes, but Thaddeus caught the flicker of a smile she tried to hide. Max, on the other hand, looked unconvinced. Elone cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "This is just the beginning," she said, her tone firm. "You don't get to waltz in and expect them to accept you overnight. If you're serious about this, you'll have to prove it." "I understand," Thaddeus said, meeting her gaze. "I'm here for the long haul, whatever it takes." The days that followed were awkward and tense. Thaddeus made an effort to learn about his children's lives, but it was clear they weren't ready to let him in. He attended Zoe's high school art showcase, where she reluctantly introduced him to her friends as "just someone my mom knows." He cheered for Max at his soccer game, standing out like a sore thumb in his tailored suit among the casually dressed parents. Izzy, however, was the easiest to connect with. She eagerly showed him her sketches, her enthusiasm a small but bright spot in the otherwise strained dynamic. One evening, Thaddeus sat with Elone in the kitchen as the kids did their homework in the next room. "They're not going to make this easy for you," she said, her tone blunt but not unkind. "I don't expect them to," he replied, sipping the coffee she had begrudgingly made for him. "But I'm not going anywhere." Elone studied him, her skepticism evident. "You've said that before, to me. And look how that turned out." Her words stung, but he didn't argue. She had every right to doubt him. Instead, he said, "I'll prove it. Not with words, but with actions." Elone didn't respond immediately. She glanced toward the living room, where the sound of the kids' chatter drifted in. "They've been through a lot," she said quietly. "Don't make promises you can't keep." "I won't," he said firmly. Later that night, back in his penthouse, Thaddeus found himself looking through old photos of him and Elone. He hadn't realized how much he had missed until now, how much he had lost. His chest tightened as he thought about the years he had wasted chasing wealth and power, all while missing out on the most important moments of his life. For the first time in decades, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to rebuild what he had lost. Not just for himself, but for Elone and the children. As he stared at a photo of a younger, happier version of himself with Elone by his side, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't let them down again. No matter how long it took, he would prove that he was more than the man who had walked away. Building bridges. The next few weeks tested Thaddeus Langston in ways he had never anticipated. For a man who thrived in the cutthroat world of billion-dollar deals and high-stakes negotiations, reconnecting with his children was a challenge of a different kind. Boardrooms and power plays had a set of rules, but this was uncharted territory. Elone had been clear. This wasn't going to be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. The kids needed consistency, not grand gestures, and they would set the pace. Thaddeus accepted this as his new reality, though he couldn't help but wonder if he was truly prepared for the journey ahead. One crisp Saturday morning, Thaddeus found himself standing awkwardly on the sidelines of a soccer field, the smell of freshly cut grass in the air. Max's game was about to start, and parents milled about, chatting with one another, while their kids warmed up on the field. Thaddeus, in his tailored casual wear, stuck out like a sore thumb among the more relaxed, dressed-down crowd. Max was on the far end of the field, kicking a ball with his teammates. Thaddeus could see the boy's determination, the way he threw himself into the game. It reminded him of his own tenacity in his younger years. But unlike Thaddeus, Max didn't seem to carry the weight of expectation, just pure, unfiltered passion. As the game began, Thaddeus found himself completely engrossed. Every pass, every tackle, every shot on goal had him on edge. When Max scored in the second half, Thaddeus couldn't help but cheer loudly, earning a few amused glances from the other parents. Max glanced toward the sidelines, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was a flicker of something. Pride, maybe. Before Max quickly turned back to his team, his expression unreadable. After the game, Thaddeus waited near the field as Max grabbed his bag. The boy approached him reluctantly, his usual guarded demeanor firmly in place. "You did great out there," Thaddeus said, genuinely impressed. "That goal was incredible." Max shrugged, but a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Thanks," he mumbled. Thaddeus hesitated, unsure if he should say more. "I'd like to come to more of your games if that's okay with you." Max looked up at him, his expression a mix of surprise and suspicion. "You can come, if you want," he said, his tone neutral. It wasn't much, but it was something. Thaddeus nodded, a small wave of relief washing over him. Meanwhile, Thaddeus found himself navigating a different kind of challenge with Zoe. At 16, she was fiercely independent and far more skeptical of him than her younger siblings. She rarely spoke directly to him, instead opting for clipped answers and pointed glares. One evening, Thaddeus attended Zoe's high school art showcase, hoping to show his support. The gallery was filled with parents, students, and teachers, the walls lined with vibrant pieces of art. Thaddeus scanned the room until he spotted Zoe standing near her display, her arms crossed as she talked to a friend. Her work was striking, a mix of bold colors and intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story. Thaddeus felt a swell of pride as he studied each piece. When Zoe noticed him standing there, her expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. "I came to see your work," Thaddeus said, keeping his tone calm. "It's incredible, Zoe. You have real talent." Zoe's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to say that. You weren't there when I started drawing, when I had to figure all of this out on my own." Thaddeus felt the weight of her words, the years of absence he couldn't undo. "You're right," he said quietly. "I wasn't there, and I'll never stop regretting that. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Zoe stared at him for a long moment before turning back to her display. "We'll see," she muttered, but her voice lacked the venom it usually carried. Izzy, the youngest, was the easiest to connect with. Her curiosity and love of learning mirrored Thaddeus's own childhood fascination with science and technology. One afternoon, he surprised her with a beginner's chemistry set, her eyes lighting up with excitement as she unpacked it. "Can we try it now?" she asked, bouncing on her heels. "Of course," Thaddeus said, rolling up his sleeves. Together, they spent hours mixing solutions and observing reactions, Izzy's laughter filling the room whenever something fizzled or changed color. "You're good at this," Thaddeus said, watching as Izzy carefully measured out ingredients. "I want to be a scientist when I grow up," she said confidently, "like the ones who make medicine or build rockets." Thaddeus felt a pang of pride. "You can be anything you want, Izzy, and I'll be right here cheering you on." She beamed at him, her smile wide and unguarded. It was the first time he felt like he had truly made a connection with one of his children. As Thaddeus grew closer to the kids, he began to see the challenges they had faced in his absence. Zoe's anxiety, which she masked with her sharp demeanor. Max's struggles with bullying, which he countered with his love of sports. Izzy's tendency to retreat into her own world when things became overwhelming. Elone watched these interactions with cautious optimism. She saw the effort Thaddeus was putting in, the genuine attempts to bond with the children. But she wasn't ready to let her guard down completely. One evening, as Thaddeus was leaving her house after spending time with the kids, Elone stopped him at the door. "You're doing better than I expected," she admitted. "But this isn't just about them trusting you. It's about me trusting you too." Thaddeus met her gaze, his expression earnest. "I know," he said, "and I'll keep proving to you that I'm not the man I used to be." Elone nodded, but her walls remained firmly in place. "We'll see," she said, echoing Zoe's words. Back in his penthouse that night, Thaddeus reflected on the day's events. He thought about the progress he had made, however small, and the long road still ahead. For the first time in years, he felt like he was working towards something that truly mattered. As he looked out over the city, the lights twinkling like stars in the distance, he made a silent promise to himself. He would not fail them. Not this time. Old wounds and new promises. The evening breeze carried the faint scent of autumn as Thaddeus Langston parked his car outside Elone's house. It was a routine visit, one he had started looking forward to despite the tension that still lingered between him and his children. Tonight, however, the air felt heavier, as though something unsaid was waiting to surface. Inside, the house was alive with activity. Max's soccer gear was strewn across the living room, Zoe's sketches covered the dining table, and Izzy was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, her chemistry set spread out in front of her. It was chaotic, warm, and entirely unlike the sterile, orderly world Thaddeus was used to. For all its imperfections, it felt real. "Dad, you're late," Max said, glancing up from the couch where he was polishing his soccer cleats. His tone was casual, but Thaddeus caught the flicker of expectation in his eyes. "Traffic," Thaddeus said with a small smile, loosening his tie. "But I'm here now. What's the plan for tonight?" "We're watching a movie," Izzy chimed in, bouncing on her heels. Zoe picked it. Zoe rolled her eyes from her spot at the dining table. "Don't get your hopes up, Dad. It's probably too lowbrow for you." Thaddeus chuckled, catching the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. "I'm open to anything." The movie night began with popcorn and plenty of bickering over seating arrangements. Thaddeus found himself squeezed between Max and Izzy on the couch, their energy infectious. Zoe sat in the armchair, her arms crossed, but her focus occasionally drifted toward him. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. After the movie ended and the kids headed upstairs to bed, Thaddeus lingered in the living room with Elone. She had been quieter than usual that evening, her watchful eyes observing every interaction. "You're getting better at this," she said finally, her tone neutral but not unkind. "I'm trying," Thaddeus replied, leaning back on the couch. "But I know I have a long way to go." Elone nodded, her expression thoughtful. "They're warming up to you, even if they don't want to admit it. But it's not just about the kids, Thaddeus. There's more to this than showing up." He frowned, sensing the shift in her tone. "What do you mean?" Elone hesitated, then gestured toward a small wooden box on the bookshelf. "That's what I mean. Go ahead. Open it." Curious, Thaddeus walked over and retrieved the box. Inside, he found a collection of letters, worn, crinkled, and never sent. They were addressed to him, each one marked with a different date, spanning the last 15 years. "What are these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Letters I wrote but never sent," Elone said, her voice steady. "Every time I wanted to tell you about the kids, every time I wanted to reach out, I wrote one. But I always talked myself out of it. I didn't think it would make a difference." Thaddeus sat back down, the letters in his lap. He opened one at random, his eyes scanning the page. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Max had his first soccer game today. He scored twice, and he looked so proud. I wanted to call you and tell you, but I knew you wouldn't answer." He flipped to another letter. "Zoe had her first art show at school. She's talented, Thaddeus, more than I ever expected. But when she asked me why her dad wasn't there, I didn't know what to say." His hands trembled as he read more, each letter a window into the life he had missed. The milestones, the struggles, the quiet moments of joy. Elone had captured them all, and he hadn't been there to see any of it. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I didn't know she tried to reach me." Elone's expression softened, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I did try, Thaddeus, but you were so wrapped up in your world, and I didn't have the strength to keep fighting for a place in it. So I stopped." The weight of her words settled over him, a crushing reminder of the choices he had made. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For not being there, for not seeing what I was losing." Elone didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for one of the letters and handed it to him. "This was the last one I wrote," she said, "right before I decided to stop trying." Thaddeus unfolded the letter carefully, his heart pounding as he read. "I'm done fighting for you to care, Thaddeus. The kids deserve better than an absentee father, and I deserve better than being the one who keeps waiting for you to notice us. I hope one day you'll realize what you've lost. Until then, we'll be fine without you." He closed the letter, his chest tight. "You were right," he said quietly. "You did deserve better. And so did they." Elone sighed, leaning back in her chair. "The past is the past. What matters now is what you do moving forward. The kids are starting to trust you, but it's fragile. Don't give them a reason to regret it." "I won't," Thaddeus promised. "I'll prove it to them. And to you." The next morning, Thaddeus made a decision. He cleared his schedule for the entire week, a move that shocked his board and frustrated his executives. But he didn't care. For the first time in his life, his priorities were clear. He spent the week immersing himself in his children's lives. He helped Zoe prepare for an upcoming art competition, spending hours discussing her ideas and offering constructive feedback. She was hesitant at first, but eventually started seeking his input, her guarded demeanor softening. With Max, Thaddeus attended every soccer practice and even joined him for a one-on-one game in the backyard. Max's competitive streak quickly turned into laughter as Thaddeus stumbled through the game, clearly out of practice. And with Izzy, Thaddeus became her science partner, helping her set up experiments and even buying her a telescope so they could stargaze together. Her excitement was infectious, and for the first time, Thaddeus felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Elone found Thaddeus sitting on the porch, staring up at the stars. She joined him, the silence between them comfortable but charged. "You're different," she said finally. "I don't know if it's permanent, but you're trying. And I didn't think you had that in you." "I didn't either," Thaddeus admitted. "But they've changed me. You've changed me." Elone looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Don't just say that, Thaddeus. Show me." He nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "I will. For them. And for you." As they sat there under the stars, Thaddeus felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, flickering light that promised the possibility of a new beginning. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to face it head-on. Tests of commitment. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, challenges, and hard-earned progress for Thaddeus Langston. He had thrown himself completely into his role as a father, determined to build the trust he had spent years neglecting. However, the journey wasn't without its complications. For every step forward, there seemed to be a new hurdle, a fresh reminder of how much he still needed to prove. It was a chilly Monday afternoon when Elone called him unexpectedly. Thaddeus had been reviewing reports in his office, the skyline of the city stretching endlessly behind him. Her voice, calm but firm, came through the speakerphone. "Zoe's school is having a parent-teacher meeting today," she said. "It's about her art portfolio. She didn't tell me until this morning, and she wasn't planning to tell you at all. I think you should come." Thaddeus glanced at his calendar. He had a meeting with a client in an hour, an important deal that had been in the works for months. But as he thought about Zoe's guarded expressions and the wall she had built around herself, he knew there was only one choice. "I'll be there," he said, already grabbing his coat. The school's art studio was buzzing with activity when Thaddeus arrived. Students and parents milled about, admiring the colorful displays lining the walls. He spotted Zoe near the back, standing stiffly beside her teacher. Her shoulders tensed as she saw him approaching. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I came to support you," Thaddeus replied evenly. "Your mom told me about the meeting." Zoe's eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said, holding her gaze. "Because I care about what you're doing, Zoe. Your work matters to me." Before she could respond, her teacher, Mrs. Phelps, stepped forward with a warm smile. "Mr. Langston, it's good to see you here. Zoe has an exceptional talent, and we're discussing the possibility of submitting her portfolio for a national competition." Thaddeus's chest swelled with pride. He turned to Zoe, his expression earnest. "That's amazing, Zoe. You should do it." Zoe hesitated, her guarded exterior cracking just slightly. "I don't know if I'm good enough," she muttered. "You are," Thaddeus said firmly, "and I'll do whatever I can to help you prepare. If you want this, I'll be there every step of the way." For the first time, Zoe's icy demeanor softened. She didn't say anything, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at her lips. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a start. While Thaddeus worked on building a bridge with Zoe, his relationship with Max faced its own challenges. The boy's competitive spirit often clashed with Thaddeus's well-meaning attempts to bond. Their dynamic came to a head one evening during a casual backyard soccer match. "You're not even trying," Max shouted, frustration evident in his voice. Thaddeus, winded from chasing the ball, held up his hands in surrender. "I'm doing my best, Max. I haven't played soccer in decades." Max scowled, kicking the ball with more force than necessary. "Why bother then? You're just here because you feel guilty." The words hit Thaddeus like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "You're right," he said finally. "I do feel guilty. I wasn't there for you, and I can't change that. But I'm here now because I want to be, not because I have to be." Max hesitated, his frustration wavering. "It just feels like you're trying too hard, like you're forcing it." "I am trying hard," Thaddeus admitted, "because I care about you, Max, and I know it's going to take time for you to believe that, but I'm not going anywhere." The tension between them eased slightly, and Max gave a reluctant nod. "Okay," he said quietly, "but you need to practice if we're going to play again." Thaddeus laughed, the sound genuine. "Deal." Izzy, as always, was a bright spot in Thaddeus's life. Her curiosity and enthusiasm made her the easiest to connect with, but even she had her moments of doubt. One afternoon, while they were stargazing with her new telescope, she asked a question that caught him off guard. "Dad, do you think you'll ever leave us again?" Thaddeus's heart sank. He knelt beside her, looking her directly in the eyes. "No, Izzy, I promise you, I'll never leave again. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." She studied him for a moment, her expression serious. Then she smiled, throwing her arms around his neck. "Okay," she said simply. That simple word meant more to Thaddeus than he could express. As Thaddeus became more involved in his children's lives, his professional world began to shift as well. Delegating responsibilities at Langston Enterprises had been a bold move, one that earned him both criticism and praise from his board. His mother, Elena, was particularly vocal about her disapproval. "You're throwing away everything we built," she said during a heated phone call. "All for a family you barely know." "They're my family, Mother," Thaddeus replied, his voice steady. "And I should have known them a long time ago. I'm not abandoning the company. I'm just finally prioritizing what really matters." Elena scoffed, but Thaddeus didn't let her words shake him. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going to back down. One evening, Elone invited Thaddeus over for dinner, a significant step in their fractured relationship. The meal was simple but warm, a reflection of the life she had built for herself and the kids. As they sat around the table, laughter and conversation flowed more easily than ever before. Zoe shared details about her art competition. Max talked excitedly about an upcoming soccer tournament, and Izzy proudly showed off her latest science experiment. For the first time, Thaddeus felt like he was part of a family, not just a visitor or an outsider, but a father. After the kids went to bed, Eloan and Thaddeus sat on the porch, sipping tea under the stars. "You're doing better than I expected," Eloan said, her tone softer than usual. "Thank you," Thaddeus replied. "But I know I still have a lot to prove." Eloan nodded, her expression contemplative. "It's not just about proving it to the kids, you know. It's about proving it to yourself. Can you really balance this life with the one you've built?" "I don't know," Thaddeus admitted, "but I'm willing to try. For them. For you." Eloan didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope, maybe. "We'll see," she said finally. As they sat in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them, Thaddeus felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he believed it was a road worth traveling. A family rebuilt. The winter chill had set in, the first snowflakes dusting the streets as Thaddeus Langston stood in front of a small, brightly lit art gallery. Inside, Zoe's name adorned a banner above a collection of her best pieces, a showcase leading up to the national art competition. The gallery buzzed with energy, filled with parents, teachers, and young artists showing off their work. For Thaddeus, this night was more than just a milestone for his eldest child. It was a symbol of everything he had fought to rebuild. He had missed too many of Zoe's firsts, her first drawing, her first art show. But tonight, he was here, and this time, he wouldn't let her down. Eloan stood beside him, her arms crossed as she scanned the room. "You nervous?" she asked, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. Thaddeus adjusted his tie, a rare show of unease. "A little. I just want her to know I'm proud of her." "She knows," Eloan said softly. "She's just not the type to show it." Their conversation was cut short as Zoe approached them, her expression carefully neutral. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a way that highlighted her sharp features. Thaddeus could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was bracing herself for the evening. "Dad," she said, her tone casual but carrying an undertone of emotion. "Thanks for coming." Thaddeus smiled, his voice steady. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Zoe hesitated, then nodded, a small but significant gesture. "I have to mingle," she said quickly, retreating into the crowd before he could respond. But Thaddeus caught the flicker of a smile on her lips as she turned away. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the gallery grew quieter, Zoe approached Thaddeus again, this time with a sketchpad in hand. "I wanted to show you something," she said, her voice softer than usual. She opened the sketchpad to reveal a detailed portrait of him, sharp lines and soft shading capturing the weight of his presence, the determination in his eyes. Thaddeus stared at the drawing, his chest tightening. "Zoe, this is incredible." "I wasn't going to finish it," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I started it when Mom first told us about you. I was angry at first, but then, I don't know. I guess I started to see you differently." Thaddeus reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means more to me than you know." For the first time, Zoe didn't pull away. She met his gaze, her walls finally starting to crumble. While Zoe's art show was a turning point, Max's soccer tournament 2 weeks later tested Thaddeus in a different way. The boys' team had made it to the finals, and the excitement was palpable as parents and players gathered at the field. Max had been practicing tirelessly, his determination shining through every kick and sprint. Thaddeus stood on the sidelines, bundled up against the cold. Eloan was beside him, her gloved hands tucked into her coat pockets. "He's nervous," she said, watching Max warm up. "He doesn't like to admit it, but he looks up to you. Thaddeus felt a pang of both pride and guilt. I don't deserve that, he said quietly. Not after all the years I missed. Maybe not, Elone replied. But you've been showing up. That counts for something. The game was intense. Every goal and near-miss drawing cheers and gasps from the crowd. Max played with a ferocity that made Thaddeus's chest swell with pride. When he scored the winning goal in the final minutes, the crowd erupted into applause. After the game, Max ran toward Thaddeus, his face flushed with excitement. Did you see that? He shouted, his grin wide. I saw it, Thaddeus said, kneeling to meet him at eye level. You were amazing, Max. I'm so proud of you. Max hesitated, then threw his arms around Thaddeus in a rare show of affection. Thanks, Dad, he said, his voice muffled against Thaddeus's coat. The moment was brief, but it was everything Thaddeus had been working toward. As winter turned to spring, Thaddeus's bond with Izzy continued to grow. Her love of science and her endless curiosity reminded him of himself at her age. One weekend, he surprised her with a visit to a local science museum, complete with hands-on exhibits and interactive workshops. Izzy's eyes lit up as she explored the exhibits, her excitement contagious. This is the best day ever, she declared, tugging Thaddeus toward a station where they could build miniature rockets. Thaddeus watched as she carefully assembled her rocket, her small hands steady and precise. When it was time to launch, she turned to him, her expression serious. Do you think it'll work? I know it will, Thaddeus said confidently. The rocket shot into the air, earning a round of applause from nearby visitors. Izzy beamed, her joy radiant. We did it, Dad. Thaddeus couldn't stop smiling. We sure did. That evening, as he tucked her into bed, Izzy looked up at him with sleepy eyes. Do you think you'll ever stop spending time with us? She asked, her voice small. Thaddeus knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Never, he said firmly. You, Zoe, and Max are the most important parts of my life. I'll always be here. Izzy smiled, her eyes closing as she drifted off to sleep. For the first time, Thaddeus felt like he was finally becoming the father he had always wanted to be. Elone watched all of this unfold with a mix of emotions. She had spent years building a life for her children without Thaddeus, shielding them from the pain of his absence. Seeing him now, so dedicated and genuine, was both comforting and unsettling. One evening, as they sat on her porch after dinner, she finally spoke her mind. You've come a long way, Thaddeus, she said, her tone thoughtful. But I still wonder if this is sustainable, if you can really balance this life with everything else. Thaddeus met her gaze, his expression steady. I've made mistakes, Elone. I've put my career above everything else, and I lost more than I ever realized. But I'm not that man anymore. I'm here for them, and for you, because this is what matters. Elone sighed, her guard wavering. It's hard to trust that, after everything. I know, Thaddeus said softly, but I'm willing to keep proving it, for as long as it takes. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them. Finally, Elone spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We'll see. Thaddeus smiled, a flicker of hope lighting up his heart. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was enough. As the seasons changed, so did Thaddeus' relationship with his family. The walls that had once separated them began to crumble, replaced by a foundation of trust, love, and understanding. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was real. For the first time in years, Thaddeus Langston felt truly alive. He had spent his life building an empire, but now, he was building something far more meaningful, a family. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. The new legacy. Spring blossomed fully, bringing warmth and renewal. For Thaddeus Langston, it felt like a fitting metaphor for his own transformation. His relationships with Zoe, Max, and Izzy had grown stronger, but he knew there was still work to be done. The lingering wounds of his absence couldn't be healed overnight. Trust had to be earned every day, through actions, not just words. One afternoon, Thaddeus received an invitation that surprised him, a formal invite to a school event where all three of his children would be participating. Zoe was showcasing a new art piece, Max had a role in a short theatrical performance, and Izzy was presenting her first science project in front of an audience. It was a rare moment when all three of their worlds converged, and Thaddeus felt both excitement and a strange nervousness. When the day arrived, Thaddeus arrived at the school early, determined not to miss a single moment. Elone was already there, seated in the front row of the auditorium. She glanced up as Thaddeus approached, her expression neutral but not unkind. "You're early," she remarked, shifting slightly to make room beside her. "I wouldn't miss this," he said, taking the seat. The event began with Zoe's art showcase. Her piece, an abstract depiction of a fractured mirror slowly fusing back together, drew murmurs of admiration from the crowd. Thaddeus could see her nerves as she stood by her piece, explaining its inspiration. "It's about fixing things," Zoe said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her words. "Even when it feels like it's too late, there's always a way to start putting the pieces back together." Thaddeus felt a lump in his throat. He clapped louder than anyone when she finished, catching her eye as she returned to her seat. She rolled her eyes at his enthusiasm, but he didn't miss the small smile she tried to hide. Next came Max's performance. It was a comedic skit, and while Max didn't have the lead role, his charisma and energy lit up the stage. Thaddeus laughed along with the audience, his pride swelling as Max delivered his lines with perfect timing. After the curtain call, Max spotted him in the crowd and gave a small wave, one that Thaddeus returned with a grin. Finally, it was Izzy's turn. She stood in front of a table covered in beakers, wires, and a small contraption she had built herself. Thaddeus could see her hands shaking as she adjusted the microphone. "This is my project," Izzy began, her voice trembling but determined. "It's a water filtration system that uses solar power to clean dirty water. I built it because I want to help people who don't have clean drinking water." The audience clapped politely, but Thaddeus stood up, clapping with such enthusiasm that others joined in. Izzy's cheeks flushed with pride as she looked over at him, her confidence blooming. After the event, the family gathered outside the school, the kids chattering excitedly about their performances. Elone stood beside Thaddeus, her arms crossed, but her expression softer than usual. "They're amazing," Thaddeus said, his voice filled with pride. "They are," Elone agreed. She hesitated, then added, "And they've noticed how much effort you've put in." "So have I." Thaddeus turned to her, his expression serious. "I meant what I said. Elone, I'm here for the long haul. For them. And for you, if you'll let me." Elone looked at him for a long moment, her guarded walls still in place but visibly cracking. "It's not just about showing up, Thaddeus. It's about staying. About proving that this isn't just a phase or a way to ease your guilt." "I know," he said, "and I'll keep proving it, every day for as long as it takes." She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she watched as Max tugged on Zoe's sleeve, teasing her about her art, while Izzy proudly explained her project to a group of curious parents. For the first time in years, they looked like a family. A real, connected family. "I'll give you this," Elone said finally, her voice soft. "You're not the man I left all those years ago. You've changed. And that means something." Thaddeus nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you," he said simply. Months passed, and the Langston family began to find a new rhythm. Thaddeus continued to balance his role as a father with his responsibilities at Langston Enterprises, but his priorities had shifted. He delegated more, giving his trusted executives greater control while carving out time for his family. He attended every one of Max's soccer games, cheering loudly from the sidelines. He helped Zoe prepare for her national art competition, offering support and encouragement without overstepping. and he spent countless afternoons with Izzy, stargazing and experimenting with new science projects. The kids still had their moments of doubt, their lingering fears that he might disappear again. But with each passing day, their trust in him grew stronger. One evening, as they all sat around the dining table, laughing, teasing, and sharing stories, Thaddeus felt a profound sense of peace. This was what he had been missing all those years. Not the skyscrapers, the wealth, or the accolades, but this. The messy, beautiful chaos of family. Elone watched him from across the table, a small smile playing on her lips. She could see the man he had become, the father her children deserved, and the partner she had once hoped he could be. As the kids ran off to the living room, leaving the adults to finish their tea, Elone turned to Thaddeus. "You've proven me wrong," she said simply. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile on his face. "I have." She nodded. "I didn't think you could change, but you have. And I'm glad, for their sake and for yours." Thaddeus reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "For all of us, Elone." She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that made his chest tighten. That night, as Thaddeus walked to his car, he looked back at the house. The warm glow of the lights, the sound of laughter spilling out onto the porch. It wasn't the penthouse or the sprawling estate he had once dreamed of, but it was home. And for the first time in his life, Thaddeus Langston knew exactly where he belonged.